Hi everyone. Today we are going to discuss about a new topic in statistics called the correlation. What is actually correlation means? Correlation means a relationship between two or more variables in a given series. We can see that there are two types of distribution. First one is univariate distribution and bivariate distribution. Univariate distribution means a distribution only deals in the case of a single variate or a single variable called univariate. Uni means one, so only a single variable is there, then it is called a univariate distribution. On the other hand, there is two or more variables considered simultaneously, then it is called a bivariate distribution. So for example of univariate distribution such as a height of a person or weight of a person or a wage distribution, etc. In the case of a bivariate distribution, height and weight of a person or demand and price of a commodity, etc. Or we can say that the savings and interest rate, etc. Clear? So correlation simply means the relationship between two or more variables. There are two types of distribution: univariate distribution and bivariate distribution. Univariate distribution deals with a single variable such as distribution of wage, height, weight, etc. In the case of univariate distribution, two or more variables are simultaneously dealt with. Okay, example, individual items in a for example, we can see that height and weight of an individual or price and demand, savings and interest rate, etc. So types of correlation: depending on the nature of relationship that exist between the concerned variables, correlation can be positive or negative. Similarly, based on the extent of relation, it can be perfect or otherwise. Okay, when we move to the types, the first one is positive and negative correlation. Correlation is said to be positive if values of two variables move in the same direction. In other words, if with an increase in the values of one variables, values of the other variables also increases, and vice versa, then this correlation is said to be positive. The type of relationship between income and consumption, price and supply, etc. So we can see that if the income of a person goes rise, then the consumption of goods and services is also goes up. Or we can look on the relationship between price and supply. If the price goes up, then the supply also rises at the same direction. So the direction is same, then it is called a positive correlation. In the case of a negative correlation, if value of two related variables moves in the opposite direction, that is called a negative relation. With an increase in the value of one variable leads to a decrease in the value of another variable called negative correlation. Okay, for example, price and demand, interest and investment, etc. The next one is perfect correlation. If the extent of relationship between two variables in a fixed proportion called perfect correlation. If the value of both variables moves in the same direction in a fixed proportion called perfect positive correlation, and an opposite direction called a negative perfect correlation. So if correlation is perfect positive, then the value of correlation coefficient will be 1, or the correlation is said to be perfect negative and the value of that will be -1. Is it clear? So perfect correlation means the relationship between two variables in a fixed proportion. in a fixed proportion. That's why it's called a perfect correlation. And there are two types of perfect correlation. First one, positive perfect correlation, because positive correlation means what? The relationship between two variables moves in the same direction. So that will be applied in the case of a fixed proportion called a positive perfect correlation. The value become 1. And in the case of negative correlation, the opposite direction, the value the relationship moves in the different or the opposite direction, called a negative correlation. That way, that's apply in the case of a perfect correlation, then it is called a negative perfect correlation, and the value of perfect negative correlation become -1. And we are moving to the third type of correlation, that is simple, partial and multiple correlation. Depending on the number of variables considered, correlation can be simple, partial and also multiple. In simple correlation, we can say that the relationship between two variables is considered, while in both partial and multiple correlation, 3 or more variables are considered simultaneously. 3 or more variables are considered simultaneously. So in the case of partial distribution, we recognize the existence of the relationship between more than two variables, and the influence of only two variables is studied, and the other variable will be constant. We can assume that the third variable is to be constant. Only two variable is existing. Clear? Then in the case of multiple correlation, the relationship between more than two variables are to be or considered to be simultaneously. More than two variables are simultaneously considered, then it is multiple. In the case of partial, the relationship between two variables is existing, the other variables assumed to be constant, that is called a partial. And the direction between the above three types of correlation can be illustrated using the following example. So in economic theory, we can see that the demand for a commodity is determined by so many factors. Okay, demand for a commodity is determined by so many factors. For example, price of a commodity or price of related goods, income of the consumer, expectations price, taste and preference, etc. Okay, if we study the relationship between demand and price of the commodity, ignoring all other determinants of demand, we only considering one variable, ignoring all other variables. And in the case of simple correlation, we only considering the relationship between two variables alone, that is called a simple correlation. And if we study the relationship between demand and price of the commodity, keeping the influence of all the other determinants of demand to be constant, then it is called a partial correlation. That is, considering only one variable and other variables to be constant, then it is called a partial correlation. And if we study the relation of demand with any two or more determinants simultaneously, that is called a multiple correlation. Clear? Simple means there is only a relationship between two variables, and we are considering the relationship between two variables and other variables become constant, then it is called a partial. And simultaneously we are considering more than 2 or 3 variables, which is called a multiple correlation. Clear? Then we are moving to the next type, that is linear or non-linear correlation. Linear or non-linear correlation, that is the last type of correlation. So correlation is said to be linear. Correlation is said to be linear if the value of variables changes in a fixed ratio. The value of variables changes in a fixed ratio, that is called a linear. We can see the example there. Suppose a demand schedule is given as follows. The price in rupees 2 for 6 8 10 and the demand is given there 5 for 3 2 1, and in the case of the ratio of change in price and demand at each stage remains the same ratio, that is 2:1. So the increase in the price and demand changes in a fixed ratio, then it is called a linear correlation. The table shows a linear relationship between the ratios of price and demand. So hence the correlation is linear. If two variables are linearly related, we can see that there is a linear relationship between price and demand because the ratio exists between them is 2:1. On the other hand, if the value of two related variables change in different ratios, same ratio, then it is said to be linear, and it is a different ratio, then it is called a non-linear relationship in a different ratio. Clear? For example, consider the following supply schedule. Supply schedule is given there, where the proportion of the change in price and supply is changing continuously. The proportion is changing, but the ratio is different. That's why it is called a non-linear correlation. Clear? So the graph of two variables with a non-linear correlation will be a curve with one or more bends, because the ratio is different. That's why there is more bends is there in the graph of non-linear correlation. In reality, linear correlation between two variables is rarely found. So in the case of non-linear correlation, curve will be more than 2 bends, but in the case of linear, it is rarely found. I think it is clear for you. This correlation means a relationship between two or more variables, and there is a univariate or bivariate distribution. In the case of univariate distribution, only considering a single variable. Bivariate, we are considering more than two variables, and there are several types of correlation. First type of correlation is positive and negative correlation. If the relationship between two variables moves in the same direction, called a positive correlation, and in the negative direction or the opposite direction, called a negative correlation. When we apply this positive correlation in a fixed proportion, called a positive perfect correlation, and a negative in the case of negative correlation applied in the case of a fixed proportion, called negative perfect correlation. And there is a simple, partial and multiple correlation is there, and the last one is linear and non-linear correlation. Thank you everyone.